the faults in me. Yes, oh, 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 the faults in me. Yes, little David, David. Yes, that shepherd boy. Yes, well, he killed Goliath. Yes, then he shouted for joy. Yes, oh, Jonah, Jonah. Yes, in the middle of the sea. Yes, well, Jonah cried out.
Evil is always human. Evil is unspectacular and always human and shares our bed and eats at our table. W. H. Auden. Chapter 1. The Hanging, May 11th, 1912. Mama didn't have to holler a second time that morning. We was up and getting ready as soon as we could be. We was going to a hanging, likely the onlyest one we would ever see, to hear Daddy tell it. He'd been in a good mood for a week or two talking about it. I seen a fella one time get hung when I was little, he said at supper right after he heard about this one. It's a sight. I didn't think they'd do no more of 'em out where you could see 'em. They got to where they do 'em inside and can't nobody see 'em. Daddy wanted to go and we did too. Living on Mr. Caudell's place, working his fields, there weren't much to do but work. Taking a day off and going to see a hanging sounded like a right good time to all of us. I weren't but about 12 years old. If it hadn't been for taking care of little Carl, I would have been in the field just like Mama and Daddy by then. You reckon he's going to let us go? I asked my sister Gladys right after Daddy talked about the hanging. He ain't letting us stay here without him. I knowed she was right. If Daddy went, we went. Didn't none of us go nowhere without him. He didn't go nowhere without us. It was the way we was. There was many a time that Daddy would need to go do some business with the folks that we worked for. If he had left us at home, we could have got some work done, but he took us with him every time. It had been that way where we lived before, and it was that way now that we was with Mr. Caudell. Even if all Daddy was doing was going down there to tell him that a plow was busted or we needed fertilizer, we all went. A hanging, though, was something different. I got to thinking, we hadn't never been to nothing just to have a good time. A hanging was special, and we was all getting to go. Daddy told us that we would leave for it early that morning, right after we fed the animals and eat. Mama didn't say nothing about it. She was busy with the baby while Daddy was getting the mules and the wagon ready for our trip to town. Mama and Gladys was getting things together for us to take. Mama was holding the baby while Gladys filled up a croaker sack with what we was taking. I had finished feeding the chickens, that was my job every morning, and was helping little Carl get dressed. Little Carl was my brother. He weren't much younger than me, less than a year I think, but most of the time he needed help with everything he done. He had got kicked in the head when he was little and never got over it. Sometimes little Carl would slip into a spell which Daddy called his idiot spell, and he would just sit and stare with one eye half closed and his mouth hung open. He would go a good while without having a spell. Then he would go another good while having them all the time. There weren't no telling how he would do, especially on a trip like going to the hanging. We didn't go nowhere like this, so there just weren't no telling. It made Mama sad to have to mess with little Carl, so I had took him on to raise, I guess you'd say. Since the baby was born, Mama was pretty busy anyhow, so it weren't like she had time for two at once. When I got dressed and pulled my boots on, we went outside to the wagon. In a minute, Gladys come out too, toting the baby and the croaker sack. I helped little Carl up on the back of the wagon and then turned around and helped Gladys. She hung on to that baby, giving me the sack. Gladys was a little older than me, old enough that if she'd ever had a chance to meet boys, she would have probably had a boyfriend. She was a pretty girl, but a little on the skinny side like the rest of us. She had black hair like the rest of us did except for Daddy. His hair was brownish and bushy, and it always looked like it was trying to get off his head, it would stick up so. Us young'uns all got on the back of the wagon. It and the mule belonged to Mr. Caudell, just like the house we lived in and the land we worked. I didn't figure Daddy had asked him about using the wagon to take us to the hanging. I knowed we was allowed to use it for trips we had to make to town and to go to church, though we didn't do that. It was taking a day off from the farm that Mr. Caudell might not like. Still, it was a hanging, and there probably weren't much farming going on that day anywhere in the county. You had to figure the man would expect us to want to go see it. Mama came out, and she went to the outhouse. She had done sent each of us in there, knowing what the trip to town would not include any pee stops. When Mama finally came to the wagon, Daddy got the mules going. It would take a good while to get to town, and he'd be in a bad mood if the trip got slowed down. As we got going, us young'uns slid down to the rear of the wagon so we could talk low and not have Daddy hear us. And you didn't want to make him mad. He said he wasn't going to put up with us acting up. He never did. Once we got going good, the noise of the wagon rolling on the road was enough for us to be able to talk some at the back of the wagon if we was careful. "Gladys, who they hanging?" My sister Gladys was a right smart girl. She could figure things out good without knowing everything there was to know. Before the baby was born, she had started doing some of the cooking to help Mama out. She could make the most anything in the world worth eating, which was good on account of us not having no whole lot of choice about what we was going to eat. "It's a man named Paul Tidwell. I heard Mr. Caudell talking to Daddy about it last week. They was sitting on the porch talking about our bill down at the store. Mr. Caudell mentioned it on account of figuring the store would be closed on Saturday so all the folks could get off work and go see the hanging." "Why they hanging him?" "He killed his wife and his 2 little girls right after Christmas." Little Carl was listening to her, having a pretty good day that day. "Why did he do that, Gladys?" Well, the truth is, Gladys didn't know at all why the man killed his wife and them 2 little girls. But Gladys was good at thinking, and she thought up a good story, and we didn't care much whether it was true or not as long as it was good. You had to catch her in the mood to talk. She weren't always in such a mood. Some days she'd be all blowed up like a bullfrog and wouldn't say nothing to nobody but Mama, and then it weren't but a word or two. I was right glad when she was in a talking mood that day. "He was crazy," Gladys told us. "He said the devil had got into them." We didn't go to church, but we knowed who the devil was. The devil was who folks blamed when they done something bad and got caught at it. I didn't much figure it was the devil getting into folks as it was folks just getting caught and wanting to blame somebody else for it. You see that a lot. "The devil is bad," little Carl said a little too loud. Daddy's head turned a bit, but he didn't speak. We sat there quiet for a bit, not wanting Daddy to stop that wagon. It'd be bad for us if he did. "His wife was a big fat woman," Gladys whispered to us, making little Carl grin and hold his mouth to keep from giggling out loud. "She would have made 3 of him. The little girls were fat too. All 3 of them eat the groceries so bad Mr. Tidwell had all he could do to try to feed 'em. He was a little bitty man, like I told you. He couldn't hardly see without his glasses. I bet he married that woman when he weren't wearing them glasses," little Carl whispered, and we all held our mouths then. Gladys went on. "He had done got put off the Upson place," she said. "Mr. Upson accused him of slacking off and letting crops rot in the ground, but he said he was doing his best. Him just having them 2 girls and no boys to help him made it rough. Between trying to feed them women and trying to make a crop for Mr. Upson, little Tidwell weren't getting much of neither one done. He got into it with Mr. Upson and he got put off the property. He took a place on the McKillop's property for a while, and then he got on with the Tate brothers. Everybody knowed the Tate brothers, Peter and Paul. Folks called them Pete and Repeat because the older one had been a jackleg preacher till he saved up enough money to buy some farmland. Peter Tate liked to talk about Jesus this and the good Lord that, and his little brother Paul would amen every comment. They was the kind of fellows that didn't have nothing to do with you less than they could make $1 off of you. There was a lot of them kind of folks. Most landlords didn't care much about the eternal souls of the folks that worked for them. The Tate brothers did. All landlords let their folks, even the colored hands, off to go to church on Sunday morning. The Tate brothers made their tenants go to church. If you didn't go, they'd run you off. Tidwell had never been a religious man. He went to camp meetings and to revivals, but everybody done that. When the Tate brothers told him he'd be expected at services as part of his arrangement, he didn't argue. It sounded to him like he was getting a Sunday morning break. More like it'd be a chance for the Tates to talk poor Tidwell into donating to them Any little piddling profit they didn't take some other way. Mr. Tidwell went to Pete Tate's church, the Temple of Apostolic Faith, Gladys said. We knew of the place because it was the only brick building on our end of the county. They had a new young preacher named Kelly, and he was really drawing crowds with his preaching. Peter Tate had handpicked the Kelly fellow because he was single and wouldn't need much of a salary to minister the place. This fellow made folks feel bad about how they was and good about how Jesus was, and folks that go to church regular really like that. I didn't say anything to that. I knowed that Gladys had to be laying it on then because she wouldn't know anything about why this fellow had been the preacher. We had been to church 3 times. One time after little Carl got kicked. It was long and hot, and I about went to sleep except they'd sing and wake everybody up. I reckon if you run a church, you know how to do something to keep folks from sleeping through the whole thing. The other times we had been there was for funerals. The first funeral was for my granddaddy, a man I didn't ever meet. He was Mama's daddy, and it was the only time I know of that we seen any of Mama's people except for Aunt Clara. They all come over and spoke to Mama. Daddy didn't say nothing to none of them, and they didn't say nothing to him. Gladys went on with her story. Mr. Tidwell got to liking church more than anybody would have expected him to. Some folks is like that. They get to hearing about how good Jesus is, and the next thing you know, they want to be just like him. Make him proud of them in a way most folks want to make their mamas proud. The preacher gave him an old Bible and told him to read it, and he did. He read it cover to cover. Only he couldn't read that good, and he missed a good bit of it. Most folks don't bother reading the whole thing. They just go for the parts somebody told them was good. Mr. Tidwell was trying to make something of it, I reckon. Something started happening when the cotton come in, though. The Tate brothers was expecting more to make than did. The end of summer had been dry, and the bowls didn't fill out like they should have. Daddy had been lucky that the patch he farmed was a little better than Tidwell's. It had still been a rough year for all of us, just especially rough on Mr. Tidwell. Mr. Tidwell asked the preacher for help, and of course the preacher told him to give his troubles over to the Lord. That's what preachers do when you got troubles. They tell you to let God handle them for you. Mr. Tidwell went to praying, begging the Lord to improve the cotton, to make them bowls fill out nice and pretty, to give him a miracle like he had done for so many others to hear the preacher tell it. Didn't nothing come of it, no matter what Mr. Tidwell done, or how much he prayed, nor nothing. The Lord didn't hear Mr. Tidwell's prayers no more than he hears yours or mine. Now, Mr. Tidwell had a year so bad that the Tate brothers were of a mind to put him off the property. It was that preacher Kelly that talked him into letting the man stay on another year. Mr. Tidwell, he didn't know why the good Lord didn't see fit to give him a miracle when he had done it for Moses and for Noah and for the people at the wedding that had run out of wine. Now, if the good Lord could give wine to drunkards, why couldn't he give cotton to a poor man trying to keep his head above water? Mr. Tidwell got to thinking that he didn't get his miracle because the Lord didn't find him worthy of it. He kept looking at himself, his life, everything, and he couldn't find nothing that he thought God would hold against him. He weren't sinning. There weren't nothing he could be sinning about. He didn't have much of nothing, and he was giving more than he could to the church on Sunday. But he still weren't getting no word back on his praying. He tried setting a bush on fire one day on account of that being how God talked to folks sometimes, but all that done was start a fire in the little garden he had going behind his house. It liked to burn up everything he had growed, and he still didn't hear God say nothing. Preacher Kelly told him you can't push God to talk, that God talks when he wants to. The preacher said you hear God the best when you read his word. So Mr. Tidwell went back to it full force. He was sitting at home one day reading his Bible, and his wife asked him why he was doing that instead of replanting collards in their little garden that had burned up. I believe that's when he figured it was Mrs. Tidwell and the girls. It weren't him falling short in the eyes of the Lord, it was them. He would see them whispering and talking while he was praying. He got to where he would pray with one eye shut and the other one looking at them. He got to thinking more and more about that, about how that woman and them 2 little girls was living in the ways of the world, while he was trying his best to live in the ways of the Lord. Little Carl was listening with his mouth hung open. He weren't having one of his idiot spells, I don't reckon. He was just listening, but he sure looked funny doing it. The baby was sleeping, laying in Gladys's lap, wrapped up tight in a blanket like an Indian papoose. Mama would do that to keep the baby warm. I wondered why it was sleeping so good. The road was rough, and the mules didn't seem to miss a single rut or a rock as we went. Gladys was quiet for a couple of minutes. I was scared that little Carl might come to himself and holler for her to go on, but he didn't. Gladys was staring at the baby, and I wondered if she was seeing something that I wasn't. I never heard her talking to it much, but I figured she loved it. I just wished she would tell it, because I thought it would make it feel better. But she was just looking at it, not saying nothing. I looked up at Mama and Daddy. They was sitting on the seat, looking straight ahead, not paying a bit of attention to one another or us either. Mama was wearing a dress that was a pale brown with little red flowers all over it. She had a sweater on over that. She was wearing her boots, but she'd cleaned them off good and oiled them with grease, and they looked right nice. Daddy was wearing a clean shirt with his overalls. Mama didn't get many chances to wear a dress. Mostly she wore work clothes like the rest of us. She was wearing the clothes Daddy had got for us back at the first of the year. Lots of young'uns didn't wear shoes, but we did. Gladys had stepped on a nail one time, and her foot swole up and like to have busted open. After that, Mama made us all wear boots when we was outside. Daddy cussed her over it, but she didn't pay no attention to him on that one. We rode on. When Gladys started talking again, she had dropped her voice. She sounded like she did when she got worked up about something. She'd get all serious and breathing hard. She hadn't done that much since the baby was born. Mr. Tidwell wondered why his wife and the girls weren't praying with him. He had heard about the devil getting into folks, and he was pretty sure that was what had happened to his wife and his little girls. They was in cahoots with the devil, and they was working against him. Little Carl, who acted like he was listening and thinking of the story, whispered, "So he killed him." My sister shook her head, and her straight black hair fell across her face. "Not right then," Gladys told little Carl. He was sure he could pray the bad out of him. "He couldn't, though." Carl said it a little too loud. Daddy's head turned just a little bit, and I was afraid we were about to catch it. He didn't say anything, though. We waited a little while before Carl poked Gladys and nodded for her to continue. No, he couldn't, but he sure did try. He went to talk to that young preacher Kelly about it, to find out what he needed to do about his women and the devil that had got into him. When Mr. Tidwell got to the church, he found out that the new young preacher was gone. It turned out he had met a girl in town and wanted to marry her. He had asked Paul Tate for a raise. The church had twice as many folks coming as it had before, and it was taking in a good bit more money. Paul Tate didn't much care for the young preacher nohow. He said he was too flashy with his slick-down hair and his pretty lips and his green eyes. The Tate brothers got to talking about Kelly and how he was acting. Peter Tate decided he could run the church himself until they could get another preacher hired. Turnout was always good around Christmas, so the offering would be right heavy too. They had put Kelly out, told him to leave the place they let him live in and get on. Didn't nobody see Kelly after that. So there weren't anybody at the church when Mr. Tidwell got there. He stepped inside that big stone building, hollered, and didn't hear nothing but the echo. The whole place sounded hollow, empty, like even the Lord God had got up and left town. Mr. Tidwell walked up the aisle, looking up the empty wood cross they had hung up at the front. There'd been a picture of Jesus on the wall by the side door, but Preacher Kelly had took it with him when he left. It was like the devil had come and got Mrs. Tidwell and the girls, and now he had even got Jesus and the preacher. If the devil had took the preacher, then he could take anybody, use anybody. Mr. Tidwell went home, expecting he might very well run into the devil himself when he got there. The first one he saw was Becky, the older girl, sitting on the steps outside the front door. She was eating a glass of cornbread and buttermilk. She was so busy eating, she didn't hear her daddy walk right up on her. She looked up, her little pig nose wiggling up and down, the buttermilk running down the side of her mouth. He come walking up to her, sitting there, and he weren't thinking about her being his little girl. He was thinking about the devil and whatever mischief the devil had put into her. He looked at her and said, "You got the devil in you." She took another bite of cornbread and buttermilk and said, "No, I ain't." Mr. Tidwell got mad because he thought the devil was poking fun at him. He run up the steps and grabbed Becky by the hair and drug her into the house with him. She was hollering, and her mama come running out of the back room. Mr. Tidwell looked at his wife and said, You got the devil in you." She looked at him, and I reckon she'd knowed that he was going crazy if he hadn't done gone already. She tried to say something to him, but he slapped her in the mouth. "You got the devil in you, and you got these girls working against me." She was a big old woman, but he slapped her a second time hard enough to drop her to the floor. Before she could get up, he drug Becky into the bedroom, and he throwed her on the bed. "You got the devil in you," he kept hollering at her. Becky was trying to get a loose from him, but he was hitting her every time she would try to raise up. Mrs. Tidwell finally got up and come running in there behind him and grabbed a hold of him and pulled him off the little girl. He turned around and pushed her, and she went backwards into the wood stove and hit her head against it and died right there. They found her with the side of her head busted open and her head caved in. Her eyes was still open, though, and it was like she was looking over it where her head was messed up, looking to see what had killed her. Becky had got up off the bed and was trying to get to the door. Mr. Tidwell took her by the neck and squeezed so hard she couldn't breathe. She was pulling at his hands, moving her lips to beg him to stop, but he weren't hearing none of it. Little Carl was so intent on Gladys that I was scared of what was going to happen when the story was over. If he got too excited and went to talking too loud, Daddy would stop the wagon, and that wouldn't be good for any of us. I couldn't help but wonder if little Carl was thinking of when he got kicked in the head. I didn't know whether he remembered that happening or not. Gladys kept going. He choked her till she quit struggling. When she quit struggling, he stood up and went back across the front room to the back room to see if the other little girl, Ruth, was still in there. He couldn't find her. He come back out and found Becky trying to crawl out the front door. He went over to the stove and got a poker and come back and hit her in the head with it. Then he took the poker and shoved the sharp end into her back and pushed it all the way through her. She was still trying to crawl when Becky come around to the porch from the outhouse. She screamed when she saw Becky and her daddy. She thought somebody else must have hurt her sister, and Daddy was trying to help take the poker out of her. Little Ruth came running up to them, screaming as she ran. She got right up to her daddy before she seen it in his eyes. "Seen what?" little Carl hollered. Daddy stopped the wagon, and we hushed and looked up at him and then down at the floorboards. He turned around in the seat and pointed at us. "What in the hell is going on back there?" he hollered. We didn't move. He didn't get out of the seat. If he had been going to whip us, he'd have gotten up as soon as he stopped. Even so, he would come out of that seat in a heartbeat if we spoke or dared to look him in the eye. I looked down, studied my boots. Little Carl was retarded, but he done the same thing. "I ain't going to stop again, am I?" he asked. "No, sir," I said. Little Carl echoed a few seconds later. "If I stop again, there's going to be ass whippings all around, you understand me?" "Yes, sir." A pause. "Yes, sir. I ain't took a day off from that farm for now on 3 years, and I'll be goddamned if I'm going to let you mess it up." We didn't say anything, because he hadn't really asked us anything. I looked up then, though, and saw that he was staring right at Gladys, and Mama was staring right at him. I looked down. If you looked Daddy in the face when he was mad, he thought you was getting smart with him, and he didn't care for that. He'd whip you good for getting smart. The baby rustled a little bit. I was so afraid it was going to cry, but it didn't. Daddy turned back around and whistled, and the mules started again. Gladys didn't say nothing. All three of us knowed how lucky we was. I was glad Daddy wanted to go to this hanging so bad, otherwise he would have tore us up. It would have been bad except for that hanging. When the wagon started rolling along again, we didn't say anything to each other. I thought we might ride the rest of the way like that, but I sure hope not. Gladys and her story was making the trip a heap more interesting. We were going by a cemetery, and there was one grave toward the road that was pretty fresh. The dirt was still red and piled on top, and hadn't packed down yet. It looked like a baby's grave from the size of it. I looked over and seen that Gladys was looking at her baby that she was holding, and wasn't paying any attention to the cemetery. She took her finger and wet it in her mouth, and then stuck it in the baby's mouth, and it took to sucking on it. Wondered if that baby was getting bigger. I knowed it ought to be, but it didn't look no different than it had at first. It was a mighty little thing. Little Carl was looking at the cemetery, and I knowed it was probably going to stick with him, that he had been hearing that story about Mr. Tidwell killing his little girl, and here we was, driving by a baby's grave. If we'd ever knowed any of the folks that lived around there, we might have been able to figure out whose baby that was, but we didn't. It weren't nothing that mattered. I just wondered whether them folks had other young'uns besides that one. It seemed like it made it better if there was other young'uns besides the one that died. I really didn't know. It just seemed that way to me on account of there being 3 of us. I looked up at Daddy, but I was careful doing it. If I met his eyes, that'd be all she wrote. I didn't, though. He was driving the mules and not paying no attention to me at all. I was sure proud of that. Mama's head was still cocked a little to the side, like she might very well be watching him on the sly, watching to see if he was going to blow up at us. Gladys started talking again. She didn't drop her voice real low. I thought it was because she was in the middle of the story and couldn't help herself. Little Ruth is the one that lived long enough to tell the sheriff who'd done it. She weren't but 6 years old, and Mr. Tidwell was a full-grown man. He drug her back to the house, drug her to the bedroom, and he went at it. When the sheriff found her, they said her bottom half was tore in two. She was still alive, crying and saying, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," over and over again. I didn't know whether little Carl understood what Gladys had said. He was back to sitting there looking at our big sister and not seeming to have a thought in his head except her and what she was saying. "Then what happened?" he whispered so soft if I hadn't known what he was going to say, I wouldn't have known. Mr. Tidwell walked all the way to Macon. He made it all the way there, too. Paul Tate come out to their place that evening. He brung a bag of oranges and nuts for the young'uns of all the tenant farmers. It was something that Peter Tate didn't abide. He called giving anything to somebody that didn't earn it coddling. Peter Tate said that it was in the Bible that coddling folks was a sin because it made 'em lazy. "Mr. Caudell didn't bring us nothing for Christmas," little Carl said softly. "I reckon he don't take to coddling neither." That was for darn sure, I thought to myself. Mr. Caudell didn't have nothing to do with nobody but the men of the families that worked his places. I remembered him one time coming to the house to talk to Daddy. Mama was sitting on the porch with little Carl. The little fellow was still getting over the head kick. She kept a bandage on his head because that one spot kept draining and needed to be covered up. She was trying to get little Carl to look at her when Mr. Caudell come up. He didn't say a word to her, walked right on by her and opened the door to the house. He went in and looked around, come back out and started toward the back. He hollered for Daddy, not even bothering to ask Mama where he was at. I remember watching him act like we weren't there at all, just walking on by us. Gladys had come out the front door with a bowl of mashed up beans for Mama to try to feed to little Carl. It was about the only thing he eat there for a while. Gladys looked at Mr. Caudell, and if he looked at her, he didn't let on, but he had to have looked at her when he went through the house looking for Daddy. Mama told us later on that a man like Mr. Caudell didn't trust himself around women. That was why he didn't speak to her. I didn't understand what she was talking about, but Gladys told me later on. Gladys said that she'd heard Mr. Caudell had a high yellow baby on account of his nature. I didn't find out what that meant for a good while, and I was mighty ashamed when I did. "No," Gladys said, "Mr. Caudell ain't like that, I don't reckon. But Mr. Paul Tate sees hisself as a Christian man and tries to live up to it every now and then. When he brought that bag of oranges and nuts, Mr. Paul saw the door was standing open, and he walked up. He seen Becky laying there with that poker stuck through her. It about scared him to death, coming up on that little girl dead like that. She was laying there, twisted around with blood and pee oozing out of her. Mr. Paul stumbled backwards down the steps and run back to his wagon and hightailed it to town. He got the marshal out there as soon as he could. The marshal went in and got to looking at Becky. Then he heard a moan from the next room, and he found Ruth about bled to death. She kept saying, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," while they tried to pick her up. Then she sort of just fell open, and that's when the blood started coming out of her mouth like it didn't have anywhere else to go. The marshal never told nobody but his wife what the little girl said after that. She said, "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy," little Carl offered softly. "No," Gladys said so low that I had to lean forward to hear. "No," she said, "Devil, devil, devil."
Oh, the fault in me, yes, oh, the fault in yes. Oh, the fault in me, 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 yes. Little David, David, yes, that shepherd boy, yes, well, he killed Goliath, yes, then he shouted for joy, yes. Oh, Jonah, Jonah, yes,